Everybody goes through those days where they just feel like, well, maybe I should just stop and maybe I should just give up and maybe I should say, well, it's not even worth it.
It's been one of those days for Andrew Crowley, one of those years. He's been trying to focus on his studies at Columbus State Community College, but his mom died of cancer recently. He hoped to make more time for schoolwork by reducing his hours at Walmart.
And I try to explain to them, well, I need to cut back on some of my time so I can be able to study. And they really didn't kind of agree with me on that.
So he says they let him go,
which kind of led me to be homeless.
Crowley doesn't want you to feel sorry for him. He stuck it out. He even says he maintained A's and B's while living in a shelter during a pandemic. But he came close to being part of a troubling statistic this fall. Community colleges have seen enrollment plummet 10.1% compared to last year, nearly 21% among freshmen, and almost a 30% drop for freshmen who are either Black, Hispanic, or Native American in each group. The total loss at public two-year schools? More than 540,000 fewer students compared to last fall. Put another way, more than the population of Atlanta.
Our students have life.
Desiree Polk-Bland, Columbus State's Vice President for Student Affairs, says some of her colleagues took it as a red flag when Crowley began to participate less in his classes. They persuaded him to share his troubles.
We're going to start putting that bread in there, okay?
Okay.
Then they got him a job at this campus-based food pantry and found him permanent housing.
All of these factors interfere with being a successful student. Anything that takes your attention away from going to class, studying, spending time with the material, ends up being a factor that impacts your ability to continue as a student.
56% of Black and Hispanic students have reported that COVID-19 is very likely or likely to force them out of school, compared to 44% of whites. The National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which tracks college enrollment, says the drop among freshman students in particular this fall was unprecedented. Only 13% of students who drop out return to college, according to the group.
Okay.
There are the logistical challenges, like what Liliana Palafox faces, homeschooling and caring for her 6-year-old daughter without so much as a quiet space to study. That is, when the internet connection actually works.
The internet dropping, not connecting right away, having to move around the house to be able to get signal, and then also like my daughter or my husband sometimes using the hotspot, so we share it.
Then there are the deeper inequalities the pandemic has laid bare.
My father passed away due to COVID-19.
Tyler Lopez's father was already in the hospital with multiple sclerosis when the pandemic struck. He died of COVID-19 in the spring. Lopez tried to channel his grief into schoolwork. He's a sophomore studying jazz drumming at New Jersey City University.
Multiple times I thought about quitting, I thought about just forgetting it all.
Music kept him moving forward.
The drums, that's what prevented it. My love for music, it is hard, but the love outweighs the stress.
Schools are doing what they can to keep students enrolled. Lopez's school, New Jersey City University, is a campus where the majority of students are minorities, and many are from the lowest income bracket. The school provided loaner laptops and Wi-Fi hotspots for homebound studies, in-person classes for visual or high-touch programs, open dorms and libraries for those who need them, and socially distanced sports teams operating on a limited basis. But in a year like this, it hasn't always been enough, says Jody Bailey, the school's Associate Vice President of Student Affairs. Some students have simply disappeared.
I worry about them because of rent, and I worry about them because of food, and I worry about them because of the medical issues that their families have. We know that low-income and minority families in general don't seek out medical assistance as quickly as they should for a variety of reasons, and COVID could tear their families apart. I worry for them.
If my friends are doing it, then we should all take a break together, but...
Melanie Alvarez, a senior at California State University at Northridge, has felt nearly all of the pressure points and one more. She was the first to graduate high school in her family, the first to go to college. All eyes have been on her.
The pandemic happened, I think my brother and my sister were all looking to me like, okay, what is she gonna do? Is she gonna drop out? Is she gonna stay in college? And it was hard to tell my brother, you know what, you have to push through, because I also felt at one point that I didn't want to continue anymore.
Alvarez says close friends and study partners have taken a break in recent months, but she decided to continue. the stakes seem too high.
My parents have always told me, like there's nothing that we can inherit to you other than the education, like other than motivation, there's nothing that we can give to you. So my parents' motivation to like go to school is always like number one, and I'm always doing it for my younger siblings. So they're definitely like following my footsteps.
Her brother recently enrolled in community college, so for now, Alvarez says she'll keep moving. The question is, how many others will get stopped in their tracks?
Let me first begin reading one of Dr. King's quotes about education. He states, "At this point, I often wonder whether or not education is actually fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically and scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit, in many instances, do not give us objective and unbiased truths." And I think we can really relate with our most recent misfortune that in Dr. King's statement at the last part of this paragraph where he says, unbiased truths, I think we can relate to what he was stating then and recognize the fact that this has actually been evidenced in the recent attack on our nation's democracy at our nation's Capitol building. So this idea that unbiased truth, Dr. King spoke it when he was alive and well, leads to chaos. And the reality is that we're seeing evidence of that still today. He talks about the classroom. We're seeing evidence of that, unbiased truths being displayed in classrooms, particularly as it relates to children of color entering classrooms with well-intentioned teachers and well-intentioned educators who are presenting them with curriculum materials that tell them that they don't matter, that tell them that people that look like them have made limited to no contributions to society as a whole. Again, this idea of unbiased truths not being existing during the time that he wrote this statement is still true today.
Dr. King had a keen eye for issues of inequity. And in that keen eye, he called it out over and over and over again. And so if we accept his challenge, we will call it out also. I'm not sure, except for our educators, that education issues are at the top of our agenda. I see people are talking about social justice, that's important. Police brutality, that's important. But the bottom line is education is the bridge that so many people walk over to get to a different life. Education is the bridge that people walk over to becoming, as Michelle Obama would say. And so we have to be education advocates, just like we're advocates for other things.
Education also must imbue individuals with an ability to understand history, to understand different cultures, to understand the world. And if you do all those things, then I truly believe that at the end of the day, just as I have manifested this in my own life, the words of Horace Bond actually ring very, very clear. You know, education then is the great panacea. It is the way forward. It does create in one a mind that is not hackable. And when you have a mind that is not hackable, then I think education has done what education should do.
I think when you look at education, everything Dr. Martin Luther King said, of course, was correct. But in today's world, it even goes a little further because it's directly tied to your economic viability in the modern economy. And the numbers here are staggering. So if you are a college grad, your earnings are significantly greater than if you're a high school grad. In fact, a high school grad only earns about 39% of what a college grad earns. If you don't have a high school diploma, you're only going to earn about 29% of what a college grad earns, which means if a student attending a public school doesn't have the type of education that allows them to develop the numeracy and literacy skills needed to be successful at the next level of education, they're going to be marginalized in the modern economy. So it really becomes a fundamental economic and civic right for every individual student in America, irrespective of their race or income, to receive a very high quality education from their public school. And when you look at the data, and you look at the discrepancy between, let's just say, whites and African Americans in unemployment rates and income and all that other stuff, much of this can be explained by the institutional racism built into the funding mechanisms that govern K-12 education at the state level in most states in America. And I could pick on Illinois because I know Illinois a little better than other states. But in Illinois, when we passed the evidence-based funding model, one thing it allowed us to do was to look at how much money a school district needed to educate the students it served based on their demographics, their income level, et cetera. And what we found was the old system left significant gaps in funding statewide between well-funded districts and lower income districts, but those gaps were even worse along racial lines. So the typical white kid attending an underfunded school in the state of Illinois faced a per pupil funding gap between what their school needed and what their school had of about $2,495 per kid. The typical African American student, $4,670 per kid, almost double. And that disinvestment in African American students had gone on for generations. And so if for generations, your state funding mechanism intentionally underfunds schools for low-income populations generally, but for Black and brown kids specifically, you are creating disadvantage in your economic system, a structurally racist education system that can be resolved. And so the good news is we did pass the evidence-based funding model, as you mentioned, Dr. Whitaker. And since that model's been passed, it's been in place for 3 years now. And $980 million of new funding has gone into schools in Illinois under the model. 89% of that money, or $874 million, has gone to those school districts which educate 75% of our Black kids. So the model's actually working to reverse this significant disinvestment that's gone on for years. The bad news is, that's the good news, this is Illinois, so there's going to be bad news. The bad news is the state still underfunds K-12 education according to the evidence-based model by some $7 billion. So we've got a long way to go to catch up. And this year, there has been no increase in funding, and the state's fiscal condition means next year there probably won't be either. And that's going to set back some of the gains that we are making here to reverse this institutional racism. So I think education is a core civil right, frankly, of everybody in America. And the educational system has to provide each student the opportunity to learn. And our educational system doesn't in America generally, and in most states specifically, for most low-income kids and for all Black and brown kids. We just got to deal with that. There are ways to deal with it. It's time to talk about it honestly and solve the problem.
Part of the problem for us, however, and the challenge is that of all the major professions, we are still the most underrepresented, even though we work with most of our children. So when we talk about equity in education, it is painful. Brown versus the Board was 1954, 66 years ago. Martin Luther King gave his speech in 1963, 9 years after Brown versus the Board. And here we are in 2021, still speaking about and asking the question about equity. And it's a shame. We should not have to discuss this now, but it is what it is now, and we will move forward, and we will cross that bridge, and we will surely get over, as Dr. Malvo said.
But I'd like to offer another opinion, particularly in the space that I sit. I'm a sociologist, so I look at things like education from a structural and sociological perspective. I mean, first and foremost, education is about book knowledge. Carter G. Woodson said, if you control a man's thinking, you control his destiny. So it's important for us to know our history and to know the history of others, to understand where we sit so that our young people are not trying to figure out on what side of the history do they fall. So you have to have that knowledge. I tell students all the time, you got to know the whole context in which we actually look at systems of oppression, and we also look at American prosperity. So that way you begin to understand how history has been designed. I think it's also important, as my 99-year-old aunt continues to tell me, that you have to have street knowledge. So education is not just about book knowledge, it's actually also knowing what's out there and how do you actually navigate through the tunnels of life? What's your intuitiveness around certain things? As my older aunt used to tell us, you all may be smart, but you have no sense. That goes back to our ability to understand that regardless of the highest level of education that you can attain, there's just some people that still are out there acting very foolish when it comes to the types of decisions, particularly those decisions that advance the African-American and Latino communities. And then I would say finally, and this kind of ties into my work, which is on technology, you have to have education because you need to know truth. Right now, we're in a stage where people believe a lot of what they read on the internet, what they actually pick up from other people that share through conspiracy theories. They begin to think that these false truths are what truths are about them. If I can go even deeper than that, what some of our young people believe about themselves, that they cannot achieve, some of the greatness of the hidden figures of the women that actually took us to space. The fact that we had just last week people who believed that there was a stolen election in the context of voter suppression begins to tell you that we need to look at education in terms of what types of truths are we managing. And in the technology space, unfortunately, as we get into this conversation, the disinformation and the misinformation has taken over the book knowledge. And it's directed what I believe will become a civil society nightmare if we don't get back on the train of what education is designed for. I want to just say in closing, I appreciate what Ralph said, because people often don't understand that today's society requires more than just a high school education. It does require college, but I'll push it even further. In the technology space in which I work, it's not necessarily about young people becoming engineers. The Push Technology Project tells us that you can code, but you could also install the very wires and poles with some of the technologies that we're writing off actually avail themselves. And that comes to credentialing and certification.
In 2011, the Obama administration created a commission on equity in schools. It was around school finance, but it actually went further. It had a lot of heavyweights on it. Chris Eardley co-chaired it with a co-founder of Netflix. Union people, Randy Weingarten was there, the president of the Urban League, president of the NAACP. Quite a number of individuals were there, but it was a commission that had some recommendations, but no teeth. What we need is legislation. PL 94-142, for those of you old timers who studied special ed, it was legislation for the children with handicapped children in education. Now it's called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act. It had very specific mandates for the states. Districts had to develop plans. If you were non-compliant, there were penalties. We need a similar legislation from Congress on issues of equity in schools, with metrics, with mandates about how you will arrive at those metrics. You must have a plan that is implementable. And if you fail to do that, there are penalties that can be levied against you. We can't expect people's goodwill or whims will get us where we need to get. Education is part of a struggle. As I said earlier, there's no accident that the first thing that people are denied is the ability to read and write.
I want to say, as a person who, I as part of my book, I went to 2 school districts to actually look at a school in West Phoenix, Arizona, that was predominantly populated by the children of immigrants who were always fearful of deportation. So every child in this elementary school had a cell phone. It was not for education. It was to be contacted by the parent. And then I visited a school in Marin, Alabama, the home birthplace of Coretta Scott King. T.D. Jakes actually grew up there. And there they had a one-to-one solution. It was a consolidated K through 12 school that was about to be closed, but this highly charismatic principal decided a way to get this school together. 700 students, one-to-one tablet under the Obama administration's Connect Ed program. Both schools had it. I was so impressed by the fact that these kids carried a tablet under an arm and a pencil in the other and high-fived the principal out the door. But both schools were low-performing schools when it came to state scores. And it had me thinking when I wrote this paper about the extent to which we as or educators have not fully embraced the power of enthusiasm and motivation when it comes to starting to dispel some of the myths around that have been embedded in educational systems around racism. And it was funny because this was 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. And I remember I had the state superintendent on a podcast soon after who made the same thing. He was state superintendent of Alabama, said, we got great principals like Dr. Trimble, but her school is the lowest performing school in Marion, even though every parent in my tenure there came by to either get food from her. One parent said to me in the interview, because I was doing qualitative research, because of this teacher, my child did not drop out of school, my Black boy. And I went back to my colleague at Brookings who works in education policy. And I said, why is there this disconnect? Why is it that we've not been flexible enough in capturing, if we don't want to call it creativity, but capturing the enthusiasm that comes when we get our students and our teachers motivated and excited to teach kids that come from disproportionate backgrounds? Why is it that they still, when they get assessed by state standards, are still seen as low performing schools, despite the school in Marion graduating most of those kids to local community colleges and state colleges?
Dr. Lee,
I put that out to educators because I'm still trying to answer that. Yeah.
Dr. Lee, let me answer, and I'm gonna try hard not to start a whole nother conversation. I'm gonna give you 3 answers. Number 1, the tests are culturally biased. Number 2, our students know more than we think that they know, but because the state test does not match what the teachers are actually teaching, the test is the problem, not the students.
That's my point.
I'm just gonna give you the 2, and then
that's my point. I think if we're going to try to address racial equity, we got to start dealing with these assumptions.
And then number 3, that teachers of all races need to be taught how to connect the curriculum and the standards to the spirits and the lives of students of color. And when that happens, the neurons in their brains will expand and they will naturally connect to the content and reach their fullest intellectual potential.
Yes.
I'm winding up, but I think we're supposed to be winding down, right?
We have looked at how we close the wealth gap and how we ensure that our students are being prepared at Morgan to go into some of these disciplines where virtually there are no Blacks, but the salaries are just absolutely enormous. For example, like mergers and acquisitions, like asset management, like investment banking. And so as such, we have partnered with a number of Fortune 500 companies and are seeking to ensure that our students now are going to be on the cutting edge of innovation, and they're going to be able to break through some of these careers.
What I want to say is we need to think about ways to fill this gap, and we cannot depend on the government to do it. We want to get as much money as we can from the feds so our schools are funded fairly. Ralph, I admire the work that you do in terms of this formula that gets our folks done fairly. But some of you are in fraternal organizations, sororities and fraternities. We got to go back to the Saturday school. Monday through Friday isn't going to get it. So again, thank everybody. Thank you, participants, and turn it over to Sonia.
Thank you so much. And I'll close with 2 quick PowerPoint slides, which I think that are really, really important. 2 quotes from Dr. King. As we think about, again, we can't ignore all that's going on in our nation today. What I hope, even when we addressed the inequities in the system, that you come out of this town hall knowing that each of the participants and the president of our organization and the executive director of Push Yourself believed exactly what Dr. King said. Even with the attack on our democracy that occurred at the Capitol, the one thing that brings the panelists and us all together is that we all believe this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The final quote: whatever you do, we do not want you to give up. Again, 90% of us said that Dr. King's dream has actually not been realized. And so I hate to let you go for tonight because we have such a great bond. But the reality is that we all need to get back to our respective organizations and recognize that if you cannot fly, then run. And if you cannot run, then walk. And if you cannot walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, keep moving.